The last lecture on theology and science, theology matters in science, I closed with just the strong perspective that these Christian scientists really affected the society that we live in. And, there's a struggle today. Some people says, well, why should we have the church? Why should we have Christianity? What good does it do? And there's a lot of negative press on it. But that's a reflection of people's ignorance of history, if I may say that rather succinctly, because just to introduce this lecture, and Alvin Schmidt in his book, again, How Christianity Changed the World, was listing the impact of these Christian scientists, okay? Michael Faraday, electromagnetic induction; Louis Pasteur, microbiology; Gregor Mendel, DNA; Joseph Lister, and you know that name from antiseptics; George Washington Carver, numerous products from the peanut. Even to the present day, I don't think anybody's ever been here through the Panama Canal. Have you? Probably not. But the shipping that goes through the Panama Canal, we are benefited from that. But that was a result of a Christian scientist, a doctor, figuring out why everybody that was building the canal was dying. And he discovered the mosquito was the cause, yellow fever, and the list goes on. So I'm going to push this now, and a very good sermon this morning on this is just the rule of God's law, but more so the idea that the rule of God's law in our hearts, you don't know the truth and the truth will make you free, is carried over into the society that we live in. And again, if you know your history, you'll step back and say, well, maybe I don't like those fundamentalists, and we're fundamentalists in a sense because we believe fundamental truths of the Scripture. But once you start reading history, you say, but yeah, they've done a lot of good. And again, I highly recommended this book, How Christianity Changed the World. Joel Saint had recommended that about a year ago. But this holistic involvement of being into every aspect of humanity, this is who we are, isn't it? Because we care about people. We don't just care about their souls. I care about them. When I get down to Kensington once in a while and help the church down there with some concrete work and see just the incredible destruction that the drug trade causes, it breaks my heart because it's just destroying people. But for us, as we approach this, is ask yourself the question, and this is quite interesting. This is the tech age that we live in. I was coming down here, and I was through Minersville, and I said, I should open up with that quote from Paradise Lost. And I have that. I hope you should read that book, John Milton's Paradise Lost. It's about this thick. It's all in iambic pentameter, okay? What a genius that guy was. But so I asked Matt, and he said, no, I'll pull that up on the phone. But here's a quote by Satan in that book. He says this, and it's obviously not true in the sense they literally said that, but as Milton writes his epic poem there, in quotes, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, okay? That was in the book that Milton was talking about, the fall and everything, and the demonic influences. But get that, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So my question is, as we begin to think about the power and effect of the Christian church, you say, wait a second, who would I rather be under as a human being? Wouldn't I rather be under a nation, a government that is instituting the perfect laws of liberty and has humanity's best in mind, unlike the demonic ideology that often comes with those who just want to assert their reign, okay? I think I would prefer being under the rule and reign of a benevolent God and a country that was honoring him. So, amen to that. Now we're going to move into another area where the Christian church just has so much affected history, and this is William Wilberforce, okay? So I highly recommend this book, Amazing Grace, Eric Metaxas. A lot of the content from the lecture is from this book where there's a direct quote. I will mention it. But then, as I mentioned earlier, this one, Alvin Schmidt's Christianity Changed the World. But then this one's a little guy here, William Wilberforce, God's Politician by John Holtzman. And if you're homeschooling, this is excellent. I pulled this off the shelf for my kids. It lays a basic structure of his life. So as we begin to approach him, this is the question that humanity often asks. And this was asked of Winston Churchill by Billy Graham, when Billy Graham had done his crusade in London. I think this is in the early 60s, or late 50s maybe, but he was doing his crusade in London and having a lot of success. And there's Churchill the second time as prime minister, and he wants to have a consultation with Billy Graham, all right? So he does, and it basically, and remember Churchill, there's the guy that God used to basically save Western civilization. I said God used now. You know that as well as I do from your history. And he asked Billy Graham if there's any hope. There is, he lived a little longer after that, but is there any hope? And obviously, quite appropriately, Billy Graham shared the gospel with him. And what Churchill did with it, I don't know. It's quite interesting when you study him. His nursemaid was a Christian, all right? His parental background was typical English, let's just say, morality at that time. Well, it wasn't good, but it's just God's providence that nursemaid he had, from what I gathered, was a believer. So hopefully Winston took it to heart. But when I say the gospel is the answer, this is not just a fire escape, okay? We know from good preaching here and other churches, Jonathan's and others, that you're getting the whole picture, that this book is not just a fire escape instruction, but this is the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul, right? The testimony of the Lord does what? Makes wise the simple. So it's integrated into all our life. But what's quite interesting, as you start studying history and you realize people that took this serious, it substantiates the theorem, doesn't it? And I was down an hour south of here two weeks ago, pulling out of a garage, and I got in this discussion with a guy, and he said, politics, it's a good thing I was backing out, because he said, politics and religion don't mix. And I winded my window down, and I said, you better tell your preacher to start preaching the whole counsel of God. And then I drove away. No, it wasn't an antagonistic confrontation, but I said to him, you better wake up on this. So, but this is where we are with our understanding of who Wilberforce is. I want you to begin to think with me along this. And again, I don't know where we are in God's scheme of judgment on this country. We realize at the end of the Deuteronomic covenant, there's blessings and cursings which apply to Israel, but they also secondarily apply to Gentile nations. That's us. You see that all through the prophets. But regardless of where we are still under the dominion mandate to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth for God's glory. I don't care what your eschatology is, all right? Let me say that again. I don't care what your eschatology is. Whether you're all-mill, pre-mill, post-mill, theonomist, that's a mandate that goes through all those discussions. But as we think on that, we say, well, we're walking in a covenant relationship with God, so that's essential that we do that. So this is where the value of church history comes in. And as I begin to introduce you to William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833, you might say, well, yeah, I saw the movie Amazing Grace. That was out, 16 years ago, perhaps. Or maybe you've read some books on him. As I said, Eric Metaxas' book's quite excellent. And I recommend Eric Metaxas, I think it's called Socrates in the City, his podcast. I think. So he engages with a lot of different contemporary people and discusses things. And his book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer is excellent too. But who was this Wilberforce? And you probably know, okay, he was behind the movement for the abolition of the slave trade, and then at the end of his life, the universal emancipation in the British Empire occurred. But it wasn't just that. He was associated with 69 separate social reforms, prison reform, penal reform, pushed a missionary effort into India. East India Company said, no, we don't want your missionaries here. And Wilberforce pushed that. No, we want missionaries there. And child reform, lots of different things. So Wilberforce, along with a group of evangelicals who I'll introduce in a little bit, called the Clapham Sect, they caused an awakening in Britain of the social conscience. where, quote, goodness became fashionable. So as we proceed in this lecture, what I want you to do is kind of categorize in your thinking as I make statements and say, well, what did he do and what did these people do to change the culture that they lived in? Because that's where we are. And that's ultimately the purpose we want to study this. Os Guinness, and you know who he is, the British apologist, he said this about Wilberforce. He said he was probably the greatest social reformer of all times. And yes, evangelical Christian, Wilberforce, and those people in the Clapham sect that were behind the social reform in England at the time of the 1780s, 90s, and right into the next century. So as we approach this, I want to swim in three streams. But I want to keep encouraging you to listen for lessons, historical lessons, because guess what? If we don't listen, we repeat it, right? We repeat the mistakes. And that's an axiom Lord Acton has a paraphrase of what he said, but it's quite true. And that's the case in anything in life. And even as a tradesman, what's left of me, when I do concrete work, et cetera, I said, well, I've learned I'm not going to do this the way I did it that time. I'm going to do it this time different. And I learned that over the years. And that's just common sense in life. But I want to swim in this stream, the tenor of the times, meaning that what was Britain like in the 17th, 60s, 70s, 80s, right on into the 1800s. What was it like? Who were some key people of that era? And you right away, and I did Whitefield last year, so you said, oh, that's just George Whitefield, the earlier part of that century. Wesley, right? John Newton, all right? Granville Sharp, which is quite an interesting character that was involved in the Abolition Movement, but he was a grammarian as well. And I remember that name from studying Greek grammar in seminary. Others, Isaac Milner, Thomas Clarkson. So there'll be names that I'll throw around there that were all involved in this abolition movement. But what I want to do is try to get you to see how they were somewhat connected. And then we're going to do a basic narrative of Wilberforce's life. But it's more of the spiritual and political journey. I'm not going to get into the domestic so much. I'll say a little bit about that at the end because it's quite humorous, his domestic life. He was married, had 6 children, but just the way the household was managed was, again, a little bit on the humorous side. And then the other stream I want to swim in is just paralleling it with our times, all right? Because if we're just doing a history lesson for the sake of doing a history lesson, then that's not going to do anything, just accruing some knowledge, because there's so many crossovers in it. And then at the end, hopefully you'll have time to stay for some discussion on some of these crossovers, because they're absolutely essential to where we are today. So here's a beginning. We'll swim in this stream of his narrative, and then we'll weave these other 2 streams. Born in 1759 to a merchant father who was very wealthy. And the design of people born in the upper middle class, or upper higher class of England at that time was a life of luxury, pretty much. Productivity wasn't necessarily encouraged unless you get into politics. But many of them were riding on the wave of the prosperity that came from the slave trade and even some of the other colonies. So this is the home he's born into. His father was a very wealthy merchant. But now here we're going to go in another stream. Here's what England was like at that time. And I quote from Eric Metaxas, his book. As a result of the efforts of Wilberforce and Clapham, which is the social group he belonged to, social improvement was so fashionable by the Victorian era that do-gooders and do-goodism had become targets of derision. And they have been ever since. Here's the point I want to stress now. We have simply forgotten that in the 18th century, before Wilberforce and Clapham, the poor and suffering were almost entirely without champions in the public or private sphere. So there was just a general ignorance of the poor and the suffering. We don't care about them. What's to parallel to the present time, and this is why I want to work on these parallels, there is a great social consciousness. But where'd it come from? It came from here. The trend of history wasn't socially conscious. And for the most part, other religious traditions, they didn't promote social consciousness. And this book here, again, highlights that quite good. Schmidt's book, How Christianity Changed the World. So that social consciousness in the Western civilization, you can pretty much pin it to Wilberforce and his movement as they began to launch into that. But here's the category of the poor people at that time. And I quote again Eric Metaxas in his book, entirely surprising to most of us, life in the 18th century Britain was brutal, decadent, violent, and vulgar. Slavery was only the worst of a host of societal ills that include epidemic alcoholism, child prostitution, child labor, frequent public executions for petty crimes, child labor, etc. Burning of executed criminals, unspeakable cruelty to animals. So this is the world that Wilberforce worked in. And if you remember the Whitefield lecture, a lot of the reason for that was the gin craze, all right? So we said that in the close of the Puritan era, the century before, and the early part of the 1700s, that gin craze became endemic in the sense of the lower classes. That was their drug to anesthetize them to just the terrible situations that they lived in. So as Wilberforce then moves on in his life, and I love this part here, this is what I call the Hound of Heaven. All right, you know that poem, The Hound of Heaven? I'm sure you've read that, about the working of the Holy Spirit when he's calling someone to himself. His father dies at the age of 9. Now this presents a problem for his mother, who was sickly, and his grandfather, because they want little Willie to grow up in the typical aristocratic society of partying and games and gambling and living completely detached from the real world with not a care in the world. That's what they want for little Willie. So they send him, and again, this is Providence, they send him to live with Uncle John and Aunt Hannah, all right? Thinking, okay, Uncle John and Aunt Hannah will raise little Willie. But little did they know that Uncle John and Aunt Hannah were avid Methodists, all right? Now, Methodists at that time, 1760s, 1770s, remember, that's the stream of John and Charles Wesley, or John just finishing up, was actually a derogatory term for real Christians. Because the Church of England at that time was so nominal, as we'll see in a minute, that if you took your evangelical faith seriously, you were an enthusiast or a Methodist, and they kept their distance from you. Now, what's quite interesting, though, it was Whitefield and Wesley's era. Whitefield's gone by then, just about, yes, and Wesley's at the end, but they ministered greatly to the lower classes. And that's where the revivals were. Not to say there wasn't some from the upper class that reaped the fruit of that strong Whitefield preaching, as I'll emphasize here shortly. So little Willie goes to live with them at about the age of 9, and he's there at what appears to be for a couple of years. And his aunt and uncle were actually friends of Whitefield, but they were also friends of John Newton. All right, and you know who John Newton is. Every time you sing Amazing Grace, you used to say, I know who John Newton is. He's that converted slave trader, right? And as he called himself, the old African blasphemer. And he lived under the shadow of the sins of being involved in the slave trade himself. And even being a slave for a while. He was captured on the coast of Africa and enslaved. So this rough old sea captain is with this weak-eyed, sickly little boy influence. He was a regular visitor to the Thornton's house, and there was lots of interaction between him and little Willie. And he was childless, Newton was, so he sort of took Willie in. But all of a sudden, the devil's attempt, this is what I call it, all right? And you understand the effectual call of God is that when you're the elect of God, God begins to draw you. All right, and those of us who were converted at later age, we can point that out. Not that you necessarily have to be able to do that if you were converted as a child. The younger, the better. But I can point out times in my life where the call of God was so real, and there was just incidences and providential dealings. But to his mother's horror, she found out about this, and then, we've got to rescue little Willie from this Methodist home. So they fetched him, and for the next 3 years, William tried to fan the flames of this faith that he had embraced to a point. But his mother greatly discouraged it. She's kept launching him back into this selfish socialite society that says, no, we don't want you to be an enthusiast. We want you to be living for yourself, all right? By 16, unfortunately, he was pretty much drawn back into that culture. And again, the emphasis was not on a productive life. And even his schooling was like that. When he went to grammar school, and more so when he entered Cambridge in 1776, it was a very profligate atmosphere, although he never seemed to just go into the complete depths of profligacy. He was a very witty, charming, socializing type of guy, but I think he kept a balance. And again, just remember, Wilberforce is 5'2", all right? He's a skinny little guy with all kinds of stomach problems all his life. But he was known for his charm in a good way and just his winsomeness. And this will come out, and I'll emphasize this, when we get talking about his battles. 20 years he battled in Parliament once he took on the mantle to get the slave trade abolished. But he never did ad hominem. He just attacked the issues, which is a quite substantial lesson for me and perhaps you as we attack the issues of our own nation. While we do call out individuals as representing, let's just say, demonic platitudes and ideas and philosophies that are counter to the church. But we got to be careful about ad hominem, because when we do that, it already distances us from them. But then people who are in the margin, they're going to say as well, this guy, all he does is attack them. And then they can't hear what we're saying philosophically. So as this process continues with Wilberforce, he's at Cambridge and he meets William Pitt, all right? And you know who that name is. This is Pitt the Younger. If you know your British history, his father was prime minister at the end of that time period, at the end of the 18th century. And this is William Pitt, who becomes a lifelong friend of Wilberforce and eventually becomes prime minister at the age of 24. He graduates, and then he makes it a habit of going into the House of Commons to sit and listen to the debates. So you have the House of Commons, House of Lords, you have a prime minister, you have a king, and for the rest of the understanding of the British government, you got to talk to somebody else. But for us, that'll work. But what's quite interesting, Wilberforce had verbal abilities. He was quite good at speaking, even at this point. But as he listened to these debates, he went into politics himself, said, I want to do this. Now, just remember, his motivation at this point was not clearly regenerated. You know, what happened as a young child, we don't know, but he certainly wasn't acting from that presupposition. So he went into politics, won a seat in the House of Commons, and along with William Pitt then had won a seat as well. And again, Pitt is a very important character in Wilberforce's life because unfortunately he dies an unbeliever. Pitt does, much to Wilberforce's chagrin and his desires to try to bring him to Christ. And it's sad when you think about it, because Pitt actually backed Wilberforce in this abolition movement, as we'll see, which was quite heroic at that point. All right, now we're in the next phase. So we've seen little Wilbur. He's born with a blue spoon in his mouth. He's with his aunt and uncle, the Methodists. His mom, quote, rescues him from the Methodists, all right? But now we see that beautiful theological just reality that the seed bears fruit. And we know that this is the result of the effectual call. So 1786, he's out of Cambridge. He's just started to sit in the House of Commons. His mother and cousin decide to take a trip to the Riviera. Okay, so that's along the Mediterranean, the French-Italian Riviera. Believe me, they had a lot of money. All right? They had a lot of money because in those days when you take a trip, you didn't fly. You went in a boat across the channel, and then you were in a carriage. You rode in a carriage, and imagine the roads. All right. So his mother and cousin are going to take this trip, and Wilberforce says, well, I want somebody to go along. So he talks to this Irish doctor, William Berg, whom he wanted to go along, and he said, no, I can't do it. But then he runs across his old tutor from grammar school, and this guy his name is Isaac Milner, and Wilberforce describes him as a cross between Andre the Giant and Stephen Hawking. All right, those of you that would ever watch a professional wrestling, you don't have to admit it, but I used to watch it a little bit. It's kind of fun. But Andre the Giant was gigantic, but Stephen Hawking was a brilliant astrophysicist. All right, so this Milner is a super genius by that time, but probably the smartest man in England. All right, and he had all kind of honors for being so. And as Wilberforce describes him, beyond anyone's judgment, Milner was simply, in his own category, a fantastically outsized figure, a veritable giant, literally otherwise. And then as for his mind, it was entirely beyond reckoning. Indeed, while at Cambridge, he had been given the unprecedented distinction of being pronounced incomparabilis, which means incomparable. And then he goes on to talk about he was elected to the Royal Society when an undergraduate. So the point is, this Milner is just an incredible intellectual. But the other interesting thing is he's an intellectual Methodist, all right? When Metaxas uses that term, it wasn't quite clear about his heart at that point, but this guy Milner definitely defended the Methodists in that whole tradition. And as they were riding in the carriage, this came up, and someone's name came up, and Milner defended him, and Wilberforce was aghast. He said, all of a sudden, he said, oh my, what am I doing? I've just contracted to spend months with this guy in a carriage, touring all across Europe, and the guy's a Methodist. Well, as the conversation proceeded, due to Milner's incredible intellect, he pretty much, let's just say, dethrones Wilberforce's defenses against Orthodox Christianity. And remember, as a kid, he had the seed sown. And not only that, here's again Providence. His cousin, who was riding in the carriage ahead of him with his mother, had a copy of The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, Philip Doddridge, which was a classic evangelical work. So now you have, as they're riding along, you have Milner and Wilberforce discussing this, and it's fermenting, all right? So meantime, after the trip's over, Wilberforce goes back to the House of Commons, and then he and Milner do this again. And the second time they do this tour across Europe, now they're studying the Greek New Testament, all right? So here again, you see the amazing providence of God. It's just inscrutable. And as you recognize it, it's very encouraging. And now this launches Wilberforce into a period of reflection where he begins to struggle with the heart religion of the soul. Not just the intellectual defense of it, but the heart religion of it. And he begins to review his life and the selfishness of the society that he lives in. He begins to just have remorse about abusing the Sabbath and his just the whole concept of the theater and the entertainment at that time was very risque. He starts to process that, and he's and again in theological spectrum he's being convicted of sin, righteousness, and judgment, and that's a beautiful thing. So he goes through this period of contemplation and really suffering, and many greats went through it. Right, Luther went through it, Bunyan went through it. It's a good thing in that respect. But what's he going to do? He just doesn't know what to do about this or how to get some peace. So what does he do? He goes back to base one. And what's base one? John Newton, all right? So here's Wilberforce, a socialite at that point, somewhat embarrassed to go to Newton's house. And the pastor who's almost blind at that point, the great sinner. And Newton knew him. It had been quite a while, probably, let's just do some math here, maybe 10 years or so since they've seen each other, because his mother pulled him away from that influence. But what appears to have happened as he was talking with Newton is that he straightened him out as far as theologically, that it seemed to gel now with Wilberforce. And it's very hard for just to pin down an exact date of his conversion, but after his conversation with Newton, that's what it appears that's happening, is now he's resided into evangelical doctrine. But the other thing that was very, very critical is that Newton said, you stay in politics. He said, you should stay. Because Wilberforce was debating this, saying, well, what do I do? Do I just retreat with all my money and enjoy myself and just meditating on the scripture all the time and living that life? But no, even at that point now, he's beginning to say, wait a second, I've not just been redeemed for the glory of God and the forgiveness of sins, but I have now realized that this is all for a purpose. And this is where Newton was very wise in saying, no, you stay in the House of Commons because you can greatly influence the world. It's quite interesting, and again, I highly encourage this book as you see this whole process working out. But with Wilberforce now, he's converted and his mind's changing, all right? So he realizes my time is not my own. But then he also realizes my wealth is not my own. And then he begins to see, again, the selfishness of the high elite community in Britain at that time, which was quite a dramatic thought. The first thing he does then, he begins to be burdened for just promoting a renewal of manners in the British society because it was so profligate. And he resurrects an idea which was from the century before, after the Puritan Revolution of the King William, and they had been very, very intense on encouraging godly mannerisms at that time. So he resurrects that idea, and now the royal proclamation of manners is reinstituted. All right, so it's a drive. It's basically a reform movement that says, let's try to get people together at recognizing the debauchery of the society and move ahead in that. And it was a very noble attempt. And there was others involved in it, but it's the beginning. But there was a time in his life when he made a purposeful decision. And this is what he says: God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. So here's a guy that God had worked in his mind to create a purpose. God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. Now, this is the kind of statesman we want, isn't it? We just don't want politicians that enter politics just to get reelected. We want statesmen who are principled morally, and that's why we push the Christian worldview, all right? Everybody else has the freedom to push their worldview. Why don't we? See? Characteristically speaking. So he sees this purpose, and this is now his intention as he goes back into Parliament. But in the meantime, and I call this the cat's out of the bag, all right? The cat's out of the bag. One of the big things, and this is where this contemporary theme was going to weave in with us, of those people in the pro-death movement today, they sanitize it, okay? Beautiful buildings, you see Planned Parenthood buildings, but they sanitize it. They don't want you, and if you start bringing imagery up or even going college campuses with imagery of what abortion looks like, no, that's not here, that's hate speech, we don't want that. They sanitize it. And that was quite the same with the slave trade at that point. Most people knew it existed, but they were getting rich out of it. The economy was doing well but it was over there, all right? It was in the West Indies. It was in the colonies. The slavers came down to the west coast of Africa, picked up their cargo, and took it to the West Indies, the colonies. So there was, in some respects, a detachment. So what's the abolition movement decide needs to be done? And remember, there's others in this, not just Wilberforce, but he's rising. They start bringing the reality of this horror to the populace. So statistically, since 1713, Britain was bringing like 70,000 slaves a year to the colonies, West Indies, America. Not only that, it was big money. These slaves were bringing 40 pounds apiece. And most of the time, only half of them made it there. Mostly half would die. So we have a grassroots movement in progress with many wealthy people. And this is very, very interesting as you study this. A lot of these people were quite well off, but they were getting it. And what's especially interesting is you see how Whitefield had, let's just say, been a vital part of their life, and they were converted under his ministry in an earlier part of the century. Good old Whitefield, remember him? A straight, hardcore, doctrinal preaching. The great Whitefield preached to thousands at a time the uncompromising messages of the straight gospel, the doctrinal gospel. So that's an interesting thread to follow. But what's also quite amazing is there was people from the other social strata of society starting to align themselves with not just the abolition movement, but the Reformation movement. And one of them was a famous author at that time, Hannah More, who started all sorts of benevolent works and started writing tracts, moral tracts for the general populace. So you see this movement starting to move, but then, and she was called the Queen of the Methodists, but she was, like I said, she was a high figure society, retained her presence in physical circles. But you see another guy now that comes up, this good old Granville Sharp, and he was a rather odd bird, but he was a very persistent guy, brilliant. He pushed a legal case before the court of an African guy who was in England at that time. His name was Somerset. His master brought him there, and he pushed the court and won it his freedom, Somerset's freedom, in England, on English soil. And again, the details are there in the book. It's an interesting story. But then the fallout from that is now you've got a technically manumission of the 14,000 slaves in England, in Britain at that point. So the consequent result of that was then, well, if this guy's free, then they got to be free. So that eventually worked itself out. But Granville Sharp is so important because he's in the courts and he's fighting this. He can't be detracted. Other names, John Wesley, his pamphlet on thoughts on slavery. But there's one critical figure that rises even above, and this guy was a freed slave, and his name was Aladu Ekwano. So he had bought his freedom, but he was also a very amazing guy. He was a world traveler as well. And he wrote a book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Odala Ekwano, or Gustav Vasa, the African. And this chronicled his passage, the horror of his passage in those ships packed together in irons, where up to 50% of the slaves died. Okay, and you're familiar with that in the passages, as they would have called it. So this began to, and he wrote a book on it, as I mentioned, and people started buying it. So the general populace started to embrace this and understand it. Interestingly, the Church of England was against it. All right, that's quite unfortunate. They had investments in the slave trade, and they were against it, sort of like contemporary times with what we're struggling against, the whole abolition of the abortion industry. Pseudo-Christian organizations are against it. But one of the things that really accelerated the social consciousness was an event that happened in 1781 where the Zong affair, that was the name of the ship. This captain was quite inept. He started from the west coast of Africa with his slaves, and he was such a poor navigator, he was wandering all around, and slaves started to die, more than usual, all right? And he realized that I got to figure this out, because if I lose this cargo, then the insurance won't cover it. So he figured it this way. It took advantage of this clause that insurance would cover slaves who died in a manner beyond the captain's control. So what this guy starts doing, he's throwing 6 slaves overboard. And when it was all over, he had thrown 132 over. Now, this was exposed in England, and again, the social consciousness is rising to what's really going on. But unfortunately, this guy was manumitted. He wasn't prosecuted. But out of it again came some other people who began to see this, Thomas Clarkson being one, and he was a guy that traveled tirelessly through England getting details and facts about the slave trade. And what was also very interesting, he interviewed a lot of the sailors, because they say 25% of the sailors were dying in the slave trade too. So the horror of it, the logic of it was this wasn't only destroying slaves, it wasn't only destroying the sailors, but it's destroying the moral fabric of England. Well, as time went on, there was others. James Ramsay, who was a British surgeon who had boarded a slaver and then saw how horrendous it was and began to expose it. Sir Charles Middleton and his wife and others. But the problem is, at this point, this group of people were working together now. They started the Abolition Movement, but they needed someone to bring it to Parliament, bring a bill for the abolition of slavery to Parliament. So in March 13th, they confronted Wilberforce with this, and he was already quite aware of all of this. And even as a young child at 14, he had wrote an editorial to a newspaper condemning the slave trade. So you see how this whole movement is beginning to go down this stream. And he wasn't sure what he was going to do. But May 12th, and this is where it's quite interesting, again, Pitt, not a believer, but the prime minister who supported the abolition, which is very amazing considering the recourses against us, as we'll see in a minute. Oh, it's going to ruin the economy. You know, it's going to bring the empire down again. But no, Pitt backed him, and he said this to Wilberforce, and I quote, he said, "Do not lose time, or the ground will be occupied by another." That's quite a sobering statement. He says, "Do not lose ground, or the ground will be occupied by another." So Wilberforce takes it on. This was a 20-year battle, but he did it and he felt it was the right thing to do. And again, this was a bold decision, because now his politics were not going to be partisan politics. And I quote from Wilberforce, and this is a relevant issue for what we're dealing with the whole abortion. I quote, page 118, "To come out openly for abolition of slavery at that point was a bridge too far. To discuss even ending the trade was at that early point seen as economic insanity." All right? It fell to Wilberforce to demonstrate that abolition was the right thing to do, not only morally, but also economically. Or at least to show that eventually it would be the right answer economically, that Britain could bear the short and term costs involved, and that these costs would be justifiable in the long term. So he was pushing abolition, but you understand what he had to deal with. Tactfully so, and that's the same case with our situation in our country, as we would hope we get politicians that are pushing abolition of abortion, but they realize what they're dealing with, and they know how to navigate it, which he did, and which they did. But here's another swoop over into another track. The battle against abortion is against demonic forces. We know that, all right? It's not just political, but it's demonic forces that we're fighting, all right? This is Wesley's quote to Wilberforce as he approached this. Very, very critical. You probably heard this. And I quote, "Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God will be with you, who can be against you?" Very important, end of quote. If God raised you up for this, you will win. But if not, you will be consumed. So it sobers us as to the battle we fight. Well, as he begins to, this is 1787 or so, a bump in the road, he almost dies because he had stomach problems, but he miraculously recovered. May 9th, Pitt introduces a resolution in the House of Commons to begin to investigate this slave trade. And it turns out to be an 850-page document of all this information that these people have been conjuring up in a good way. First attempt, May 12th, 1789, he introduces a bill for the abolition of the slave trade. Spoke 3.5 hours. Those of us who like to talk, and I like to talk, and I like to listen to people who talk, especially if they know what they're saying, it would have been incredible to sit in the House of Commons and listen to some of this oratory. Because sometimes they even spoke longer, but he spoke 3.5 hours to try to introduce this bill. Very ironic, as I said, assumed the guilt for all of us, and he's right about that. All Britain was guilty, all the Western world was guilty, but then so were the slave traders guilty, and so were the African tribes who took and rounded up the slaves, see? And oftentimes it was a product of war or just for the purpose of selling them. So everybody's guilty, and that's a very cogent point as we enter this discussion. But again, he did it in a way that was balanced, but yet very directive to deal with the issues. Oh, you can imagine there's arguments against it, right from the start. Well, let's slow it down. Let's get more information. Oh, the slaves don't have it as bad. The economic repercussions of Britain if we abolish it. But here's the type of propaganda that was coming, and I quote from Metaxas, quotes this, page 135. One pamphlet titled "Slavery, No Oppression" was typical. It is well known that the eastern and western coasts of Africa are inhabited by stupid and unenlightened hordes immersed in the most gross and impenetrable gloom of barbarianism, dark in mind and body, prodigiously populous, impatient of all control, unteachable, lazy. And it goes on to just give a hard picture of the inhabitants of that area. But it was all propaganda. And he closes the statement that says the traffic has provided a fortunate event for the miserable captives. So imagine that. The propaganda against abolition was just so contorted and presenting these poor people. And I lived in Africa, and I had great respect for the people that lived there, believe me. But you see the type of propaganda that was being promoted then. But that bill didn't go through. Again, 1791 tries again. Nope. The French Revolution comes, so you can imagine what that did to the abolition movement. Now these abolitionists are considered revolutionaries, all right? That was hard times till the revolution surfaced, and then these people surfaced as to who they truly were. He keeps trying. 1794, tries again. 1796, he lost 70 to 74. Someone had bribed 4 members of his party to go to the theater that night, gave them 4 free tickets, so they missed a vote. 1797, 74 to 82, he lost. 1799, loses again. 1800, it won in the House of Commons, but it was defeated in the House of Lords. 1805, 70 to 77. So this is a long battle. But the first final victory comes in 1807, and I'll just read a short explanation of this by this fellow, Holtzman, in this book on slavery here. So January 2nd, Prime Minister Granville moved in the House of Lords a bill for the abolition of the slave trade. Chief among the provisions was this one: after May 1st, 1807, the African slave trade and all manner of dealing and trading in the purchase of slaves or their transport from Africa to the West Indies or any other territory is utterly abolished, prohibited, declared to be unlawful. So the motion was delayed for several months, and it had to go through readings in the House. But then finally, it was passed. The House voted in favor of the bill by a resounding 283 to 16. So at that point, the first bill came through. Now, this is 1807, all right? So this is 20 years from the time he started pushing these legislative legislative mandates to get the bill. And then it was even longer, and Pitt was even at a stage of sickness at this point. He wasn't even involved per se in the Parliament at that, or not Pitt, but Wilberforce at that point. But he did come to speak again. All right, I've never thought to appear in public again, as Holtzman quotes him. But he said that Wilberforce is silent while the slaves required his help. And so he affirmed that the institution of slavery should be abolished. What more I say, and I say honestly and fearlessly, that the same being who commands us to love mercy says also do justice, and therefore I have no objection to grant the colonists the relief that may due to them for any real injuries they may provide to themselves. So that bill went through, and then it was emancipation in the British Empire. So 700,000 slaves were emancipated. But the interesting thing was that the slave owners, the plantation owners, they reimbursed them 25 million pounds. Okay? So that was a fairly noble thing to try to do to make that work out. Well, Wilberforce dies in 1833. Just probably wore out, all right? And just by side note in closing, he had a very interesting domestic life, all right? So he had 6 children, and he had he had a pretty interesting household with it was quite wild, actually, with all kind of animals running around, and a wide variety of people always coming in and out, from statesmen to paupers from the street. He just fed everybody. But the interesting thing, again, about him was that as organized as he was in fighting this, he seemed to be, let's just say, somewhat scatterbrained. But along with this, and I made allusion to this previous, was this Clapham sect of evangelicals who had started in the late 1780s or something. They organized around the city of the town of Clapham, which was a suburb of England. And their purpose statement was to deal with the societal reform, but even more so, abolition was their main statement. But they accomplished an amazing amount. Church Missionary Society, British Foreign Bible Society, the Society for the Better Conditions of the Poor, the Society for the Reformation of Prison Discipline, and the list goes on. So that leaves us then, and this is very shortly here, we'll enter into our discussion. Point 1, the preaching of the gospel, as you notice, Whitefield, Wesley, some of the people that were converted through their ministry were very, very involved in this, all right? Number 2, the influence of John Newton and others, providentially on Wilberforce and others. And this really, I suppose, encourages us to be zealous about influencing other people's lives, all right, personally, because you don't know what you're going to do. But also, he was a statesman with a cause, and he knew the evil of this whole thing, and it so consumed him, and he full-heartedly believed in the equity of all people in God's sight. So he pursued it with a cause. But also, knowledge is power, and they knew this. The Abolition Movement knew this, that we got to get this out to the people, okay? Now, in politics of that time, though, even if the people had a public opinion, the House of Commons, House of Lords says the people, who's the people? We're the government. It wasn't a democracy, all right? It was somewhat of a constitutional republic, but it was not a democracy. So the problem was they didn't really care too much about the opinion of the people. But that started to grow. They got large petitions signed, and that overflowed into the government. The nature of his adversaries it was pretty, let's just say, caustic. And any battle against the satanic throes that you approach is going to be demonic. And it wore him out. Because he had stomach problems, he often took laudanum and opium for his stomach. But he basically changed public opinion. That was critical. Also, the power of a team. See, he had the whole Clapham sect behind him, working with him. And there was strength in that. But his impetus into Parliament was decisions based on moral principles, all right? And it wasn't one of these guys. Whatever the way the wind is blowing, that's what I'm going to legislate. And there was power in that. And that's where, in our circumstance here, we're a little hesitant to do that or even push legislators in that, and that's wrong, because there's power in morality. There's power in moral principle. There's power in principled men and women. And that won the day. By the end of his life, they say there was over 100 MPs in the parliament that were enthusiasts, Methodists, Evangelicals. See, that came a long way from when 1986 he was probably the only one there. That's William Wilberforce.